What does the Video Game Hall of Fame, a potential shot at a Nobel Prize, and veganism have to do with one another? There are a lot of people who see veganism in a positive light. It's easy to have a conversation with a vegan and come away from it feeling as though you've been presented with facts that are hard to deny, and feeling as though you're in the wrong for eating animal products, feeling as though going vegan can really help save animals or the environment. Most people don't have the time or the energy to actually stop and look at the information that vegans share. Vegans love to cite studies, and they often rely on what has become common sense regarding nutrition for most of the first world to do the rest of the convincing for them. Because, as everyone knows, saturated fat is bad for you, right? Everybody knows that having high cholesterol is bad, right? Intake of red meat should be decreased because it can cause all kinds of health problems. End of story. Duh. Everyone knows fruits and vegetables are good for you. That's a fact. And everyone knows that carbohydrates are required in order to have a well-balanced diet. Otherwise, how would you have energy? And what about the brain, right? Well, I'd like to issue you a challenge. Basically, find even one piece of science that definitively shows causation for even just one of the things previously spoken about that people take for granted as true about human nutrition. Obviously, you'll be able to find research that may show a link, a correlation, however weak it is. But while we're on the topic of taking common sense for granted, you're not somehow magically forgetting now that correlation does not equal causation, are you? Sure, you might be able to find opinion pieces, sometimes in which the abstract or conclusion states something the data simply does not show. But is that what I asked for? Is that compelling literature? Keeping on the theme of common sense, we understand that an opinion is not necessarily fact nor evidence, right? Keep searching and then come to the startling realization that no such science or research exists. This video is a cautionary tale about why taking people, especially those who seem trustworthy, at their word is often a foolhardy thing to do, and why you shouldn't fall for an ideology as poorly founded as veganism is. Some time ago, I heard about a scandal related to the YouTube channel The Completionist. Allegedly, charity funds had been withheld for unknown reasons, all the while the person in question, we'll call him JK, continued to raise money and add to the growing funds, assuring potential donors that the funds in their entirety would go to charities that were name-dropped during the charity event. Apparently, the charities hadn't actually received the funds. The two channels I watched that brought this to light are SomeOrdinaryGamers and Carl Jost. I recognized the man behind SomeOrdinaryGamers, Mudahar, from a scathing response video from another channel, H3H3, run by Ethan and Ela Klein. The video was about allegations made by Mudahar against them.
Even cited anything as an example. It's kind of scary how willing people are to just consume all this information and take it for granted when you haven't even shown one single source. You haven't even cited one single source as evidence for me saying anything like this. It's almost like the more confident your lie is, the more people will believe it because they think to themselves, he's speaking so confidently and so factually. For him to be actually just straight up fabricating this whole premise would be insane. And it's insane.
Say what you will about the current state of these channels. Back then, I found this response fascinating and eye-opening, to say the least. I'm the kind of person that recognizes that things like a person's personality or the inevitable fact of life that they will at some point fuck up can't tell me a thing about whether or not what they are saying is true or if what they have ever said was true. Perhaps there were people who took Mudahar at his word, when, after all, he was apparently wrong about major accusations he made. I was simply too fascinated by the scandal involving the Completionist, because I remember really liking the channel and JK, and I wanted to know more about why the accusations had been made, and what possible proof Mudahar or Carl could have. I was not a follower of Mudahar, but I regularly watched and still watch Carl, who often exposes fraud in gaming and world records.
Ultimately, though, I am forced to be skeptical about any of Barbara's claims, as there is simply no evidence to support any of them, and there are so many lies being told that everything becomes suspicious. This doesn't appear to be entirely Barbara's fault, however. I don't doubt that she probably embellished the truth and overstated her speed, but the real culprits here are Guinness for putting her in the book in the first place, and the people who spread false claims without ever doing their due diligence. Never trust what you read without fact-checking for yourself. People always make mistakes, or even worse, intentionally lie in order to create a false narrative. And before you know it, you're on David Letterman making a fool out of yourself because everyone blindly accepted the fact that you're the best in the world at something.
Well said, Carl. Both Mudahar and Carl did a really rather in-depth look at the scandal involving the Completionist. The information they uncovered and provided was well thought out, although I have at least one outstanding criticism of Mudahar's research. To make sure I had both sides of the story, I watched the Completionist's response video and followed JK's subsequent actions regarding the charity funds, and I also listened to the audio of the conversation on the matter between JK, Carl, and Mudahar. Only after I did this did I feel comfortable passing judgment. Granted, not everyone has the time or energy to do that, but suppose you only watched one video on the subject and then made a judgment. We do this all the time, and what's worse, if it turns out we were wrong, we refuse to admit it, or make excuses for why it's somehow okay for us to be that confident with nothing but intellectual laziness behind us, picking up absolutely no slack. Carl has made a number of videos covering the story of someone who's known for getting a noteworthy high score in Pac-Man in the 80s. Let's call this person BM. BM claims that the score he is known for is legit, but the legitimacy of that score has been called into question numerous times. I've been following the story over time just because I'm genuinely curious about how things will turn out, and I find Carl to be a great storyteller and investigator. Another channel, Veritas, released an epic of a video on the matter, and there are some key takeaways that I would like to highlight for you now.
Little did he, as well as a few other members of a group that would eventually come to be known as Team Billy, know that they had just wandered their way into a hornet's nest, only to realize far too late the debacle that they had become a part of. You see, Carlos had come into this situation operating under quite a reasonable assumption, that the folks that made up this motley crew of entrepreneurs, day traders, tech enthusiasts, and even a seemingly well-known and apparently well-respected public figure, a Guinness World Record holder and the subject of multiple documentaries, everybody involved here were all trustworthy, well-meaning, and informed, rational actors. There really wouldn't have been any reason for anybody coming into this situation to be skeptical of a handful of what appeared to be professional, responsible business owners, hobbyists, and family men, to assume that they were on the wrong side of a dispute against what had all the hallmarks of the stereotypical anonymous mob of toxic, frantically drooling internet trolls, let alone have any reason to remotely suspect that the person at the heart of this whole thing may not have been, let's just say, the most trustworthy of individuals.
We understand that sometimes we give people the benefit of the doubt because of the presentation. Sometimes we sympathize with people and we want to help them. We go in with the best of intentions, and many times we develop a tribal connection with the people involved. We bring them closer to ourselves, and it makes it more difficult to accept wrongdoing from them, or that they could be wrong. Humans really don't want to have been wrong about the people and things they feel connected to.
Now, as Carlos did more testing and spent more time actually engaging with more of the well-meaning and knowledgeable members of the community that were still willing to actually engage in a dialogue with him, once he began to see more information trickling in that didn't exactly jive with what he had been told, once he dug a little bit deeper and began questioning some of his assumptions, and started to do more testing outside of the influence of Billy, a different picture began to emerge.
And finally, I'm like, could it be a possibility that I'm being lied to? I bought myself an old laptop that had a video out. I bought an old CRT I found on Craigslist. I did that so I can test myself. And all of a sudden, I saw it. Oh, shit.
We understand it's important that no matter how much of a neat little package someone or something might come in, we should do our due diligence.
It's actually really a bit sad, knowing exactly how this all eventually unfolded, and then going back and watching him go through these explanations for the various elements of his testing, seeing what has all of the hallmarks of a guy having, 1, been conned by somebody intentionally feeding him misinformation, and 2, making the kind of mistake that honestly we've all been guilty of at one time or another. When we believe we have the right answer, believe we're more than justified, and then let that unfortunate combination of being overly confident and having motivated reasoning give you a kind of tunnel vision, making you blind to what's obviously right in front of you. The tragic irony of this video is palpable. Watching him analyze a bunch of different players' footage, accurately describing so many of the important elements needed to understand what's actually going on here, dismissing the evidence against Billy so casually and matter-of-factly, while simultaneously pointing directly at the evidence that clearly and unambiguously proves the case against him.
We have all been here. We all know how it feels to have been wrong, to have given the wrong side the benefit of the doubt while outright dismissing the side that was right all along. Not to mention, we sometimes do this because of some weird people on that side. When it comes to the diet conversation, people will be quick to tell people, hey, you can't dismiss veganism because of some bad actors or some questionable members of the group. We should find the rational actors and listen to them. It's almost like people saying we should just give them credence just because the presentation is good. We shouldn't bully them or be mean to them, even if we disagree with them. However, when it comes to the carnivore side of the conversation, or even the low-carb side with keto, the immediate dismissal is somehow justified. We let our preconceived notions about nutrition, however unfounded, stand in the way. Perhaps we are swayed because people are telling us what we want to hear. We let ourselves be blinded by the presentation. So long as they look credible, or they try to connect with me, I can trust them. We don't do our due diligence and double-check what we've been told because of a false sense of security, or due to laziness or convenience. And then we lose sight of the big picture. We wind up with tunnel vision.
All of a sudden I go back to watch myself. I'm like, God damn it. It was right in my fucking face this whole time. But I was under the impression that they were after Billy. Billy really had me convinced, so I did not put any faith on what anybody else was saying, especially after I started the investigation. There were people on that Twin Galaxy forum coming up with such cockamamie stuff. So finally I'm like, I can't waste my time on that. I'm just going to find what I believed I was looking for, which was to show that on a direct feed, the arcade is going to look different than what a person with a camcorder recording their arcade looks like. I was confident that I was going to find it, and it never showed up. And I'm like, I just got to keep playing. I got to keep recording.
And this is all completely understandable. It's not that it happens at all that I take issue with. It's inevitable due to the very nature that has allowed us to survive thus far. But just like with everything else, it's where we go from the pivotal moment of truth that matters most. I was also convinced of lies. I was also sympathetic to vegans, their message, and their cause. But slowly over time, I started to look more into what they were saying and realize that many things are just simply not what they seem. Some things are just flat out wrong. And it's not okay to allow an ideology built on misinformation to promulgate if we want a healthy society. So what convinces me? It's not street preaching. It's not emotional manipulation. It's not a meta-analysis of junk science on top of junk science on top of junk science. It's not empty platitudes or empty gestures. It's seeing how things actually play out in reality. It's testing things and seeing if other people's ideas actually comport with reality. And it's being able to build and grow off of the things that are demonstrable and reproducible. That is how we get as close to the truth as possible. Carl puts it nicely.
Well, my friend, there are just some things us mortal men can simply never grasp or comprehend. All we can try to do is know the facts. It is almost universally known among retro gamers that running a game at a different frame rate than what was intended can cause issues. This is why when using emulation, you often need to know the exact technical specifications of the game to run it properly. But let's not trust random arcade experts on the internet. The official 1981 manual that came with the machine gives us the exact schematics of the PCB. Now granted, you may need to be an electrical engineer to understand what these images mean, but I've asked numerous experts who all confirmed that based on what's provided in the official documentation, we can calculate the refresh rate to be 60.6 Hz. But again, let's not trust experts and the official documentation. We can literally measure the output of a Donkey Kong arcade board using an oscilloscope to get the exact refresh rate. Spoiler alert, it is in fact 60.6 Hz.
We can hear something, we can question it, we can gather information from lay people, we can look at official documents, we can ask experts, and oh, what's this? In some cases, we can actually test it ourselves. Who would have thought? Now, I know what you're thinking. This is just some random case study about video games, and video games aren't important. Who cares? I don't want to learn important life lessons from something as trivial as that. Give me something more consequential to learn the same lesson through. Okay, let's get into it. We can trust officials, professionals, experts, and journalists, right? Only certain people can have a certain degree. Only certain people can get a certain job. They work that job for long enough, all the more reason to trust them. Information from them trickles down to us, and that becomes how we know things. And that's good enough, right? Because we can't all be experts. It's important that we trust people. Well, sure, who would argue against that? It's about blind trust and the damage it does. We can simultaneously recognize that we have no choice but to trust each other and be careful about who to trust and how much. But When publishing papers or articles, there's a series of checks and balances, isn't there? People can't publish just anything, right? Well, sometimes they do. If someone polishes a turd nice and shiny, it's still shit. Even if you were misled at first, it happens. What matters is if you learn a lesson and apply what you learned to later experiences. You may be thinking, well, I can trust the leaders in my community, right? My parents, my pastors, but how about the well-educated in the religious world?
Then we get to my favorite part, the one where I really caught Behe with his pants down by exposing him doctoring data to lie about a publication. This is the polar bear bit. Remember, in my debunk I showed the real data table from the supplemental section of the paper Behe was lying about, and then I showed what he displayed on Evolution News. Behe is telling the lie that mutations are always damaging, so instead of showing the actual data table, he makes his own version and chops out the data he doesn't like, which is 2 whole columns and every single row that says benign. This makes Behe a lying fraud, objectively. You don't have to understand an ounce of science to see that.
Well, companies do their due diligence. Vetting has definitely taken place, right?
Trevor had assembled one of the best teams in the world and valued at more than $30 billion. Nice. It's fair to say that he had the full faith of the market behind him. However, the pompous valuation blasted Nikola into the public eye, and some eyebrows were immediately raised. For starters, the company didn't currently have any source of revenue. In fact, they'd made just $36,000 in the third quarter of 2020, and that was from installing solar panels for Trevor. They'd claimed to have revolutionary battery tech, but were suddenly outsourcing battery tech from companies like Bosch. Cathie Wood, a well-known hedge fund manager, basically says their entire business plan is completely fucked. Had retail missed something? Investors become uncertain, and a rocky wave of sell-offs hit the stock. In fact, the company's valuation halves in just over a month. Things were not looking good. Was Nikola a fraud? But just as the sell-off settles, something incredible happens. On the 8th of September, negotiations of a $2 billion deal with General Motors are announced. Investors rejoice immediately. If anyone was going to do their due diligence, it was one of America's most prestigious motor companies. Someone as big as GM would surely vet the company they're dealing with before announcing a deal with them worldwide. Investors were immediately reconvinced, and shares of both companies soar. This was it. Trevor had done it. Nikola was real, and they were the future.
What's that you say? One example is not enough? Of course companies can make mistakes, but the media triple checks, don't they?
Dan used a site called Help a Reporter Out, which pairs journalists with sources, in order to garner a hell of a lot of free publicity. He appeared in Forbes, the Chicago Tribune, Business Insider, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times on at least 6 occasions, a fact that could be found plastered all over his website. Now here's the issue. Dan wasn't a credible source, like at all, and as a consequence he's labeled as a millennial in hundreds of articles, even though he's pushing 60. By bending the truth, Dan gained free publicity. People would read about him and think, wow, this guy's amazing. He's only 29, but he's already done so much. He's worked in Silicon Valley, and then transitioned into a successful career as a comedian. Just what can't this kid do? Several years ago, there was a buzz surrounding a former marketer named Ryan Holiday, who was able to dupe the media into printing anything he wanted. Just like Dan, he did this by using Help a Reporter Out. He even wrote a book detailing his process called Trust Me I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Manipulator. Fun fact, the most recent edition of the book begins with a preface that mentions Dan Ninen. Anyway, I've collected some quotes from the book that explain how Dan was able to get away with so many lies to the press. You'd think that fact-checking would be an instrumental part of the job for anyone who calls themselves a journalist, but as Ryan Holiday writes, that's sadly not the case. Journalists say Help a Reporter Out is a research tool, but it isn't. It is a tool that manufactures self-promotion to look like research. Help a Reporter Out essentially encourages journalists to look for sources who simply confirm what they were already intending to say. Writing online is often called a digital sweatshop for good reason. Ceaseless fight for table scraps might be another phrase for it. In 1975, a reporter might have had a few days to work on a piece. Now they have a few minutes. Today, the online-driven news cycle is going a million miles a minute in a million directions. The New York Times may still try to validate their sources, but it hardly matters, because no one else does.
Maybe you're already on board with taking things that the media says with a grain of salt. But scientists are held to a higher standard. We can have blind faith in that community, surely.
So who am I? I'm Diederik Stapel. I'm committed scientific fraud.
Through this talk on the train and through other interviews that I've read of his, he tells this story of how he became obsessed with a goal of telling neat stories of how the world worked through data and science. Stapel talks about how he would often become frustrated with real-world data. How when he wanted to tell a neat story to prove his hypothesis, the world would return back a messy dataset. A messy dataset that didn't allow him to tell the story that he wanted to tell. Now, this is obviously a twisted logic by an academic, and retrospectively, Stapel has admitted that his way of thinking back then was totally messed up.
I became obsessed with results, by finding answers, by finding what I expected to find. That became my obsession, and it pushed away all the other goals. I got blinded by my goal.
But in addition to this twisted logic, he often cites the pressures of academia being one of the key reasons that drove him to commit such terrible data fraud. In an interview with Vox, Stapel said, "There's something about me, and there's something about the environment. The publication pressure, the need for simple answers instead of allowing for complexity, the focus on egos and individual researchers, first authors and grants to individuals versus groups or university. The publishing system, the incentive system that's in place right now for academics, doesn't promote good science. Instead, it's a system that incentivizes clean and neat stories, which in the real world, dealing with real human beings, just isn't really realistic." After they brought this to Bolt, he ended up confessing, and he admitted that not only did he fake this study, but he had forged the signatures of all of the other co-authors on that paper, who were never part of the study at all. Bolt was obviously fired after this. There was no way that he would be allowed to continue practicing medicine after this terrible forgery. But the committee didn't stop investigating there. They continued to look into his work, and by February of 2011, they had investigated 74 papers of Bolt's, and they found that Bolt had not received ethical approval for 68 of them. As a result of this, the editors of 16 medical journals, including the very prominent Anesthesia and the British Journal of Anesthesia, posted an open letter where they retracted 89 of Bolt's papers.
But my meta-analysis.
But the worst impact of Bolt's research isn't just the sheer number of retractions that he's had, but it's the fact that his research has directly influenced medical practice. For example, there was a meta-analysis posted in JAMA on the use of hydroxyethyl starch, and it found that when you exclude Bolt's research from the meta-analysis, that significantly impacts the findings of the study. The initial finding of the study, when it did include Bolt's research, was that the use of hydroxyethyl starch did not increase mortality compared to other forms of resuscitation. But when it did exclude Bolt's research, because, it was all fake, then the findings of the study completely changed. And instead, the use of hydroxyethyl starch was associated with increased acute kidney injury and death. Which just goes to show the potential harm that could be caused by academic misconduct. In fact, a guy called Ian Roberts, who is one of the key people investigating Bolt's research, said that the use of colloids in surgery was probably contributing to 200 to 300 deaths in the UK per year when compared to an alternative like crystalloids. Bolt's research is a key reason why colloids were still being used by the NHS.
What's that you say? Still not enough? You want a really high-profile case, not just some random people, some bad actors. It hasn't sunk in for me yet that each of these cases have had real-life adverse effects on our lives, regardless if the people are famous or internationally recognized. Well, all right. Would someone who was thought to be worthy for consideration for a Nobel Prize for his lies be enough for you?
Jan Hendrik Schoen never won a Nobel Prize. In fact, it's impossible to know if Hendrik Schoen was even nominated. Nominations for the prizes are kept secret, with only nominations older than 50 years being publicly listed. The most up-to-date version of the archive only includes nominations as recent as 1966, and even for just the first 65 years of the prize's existence, that's a total of 22,240 nominations. If Hendrik were to have been nominated, it most likely would have been in 2001 or 2002, which means we won't know for sure for another 32 years. Of course, this video isn't about a Nobel Prize. In September of 2002, 1 month before the winners are traditionally announced, Jan Hendrik Schoen is fired from his job. A little less than 2 years later, he'll lose his PhD. This is the story of the most blatant and egregious case of academic fraud in all of modern physics.
It's enough for me. It can only happen so many times before it becomes clear that it's not something that can readily be dismissed. I want to be able to trust people, but they have to earn that trust. Being skeptical of claims is important. Properly verifying claims equally so. Relying on other people to do this work for you and just regurgitating information is precisely how lies spread and wind up becoming common sense that for the average person is not to be questioned. I recognize that it's serious, as it has overarching deleterious implications for all of us. I'm one of the few people on Earth who is genuinely concerned with the rise of health issues around the world. This is not just a desperate attempt to not have to stop eating meat. This is not cope. This is about taking personal responsibility for the false information we share and equally taking responsibility for the issues we cause in ourselves and in others when things go horribly wrong on account of it.
This really elevates Macchiarini's status in this field. Not long after that, he performs the same surgery on another patient, an American man named Christopher Lyles. Again, very mysteriously, he's discharged early, goes back to the US, and sadly dies 3 months later. Nonetheless, another article gets written about it. Mr. Lyles returned home to Maryland in January but died in March. Macchiarini said that the implant had been functioning well. Despite that setback, in June, Macchiarini performed similar operations on 2 patients in Russia. Both have been discharged from the hospital and are doing well, he said. And you see this over and over again in the media around this time. Everyone just keeps taking him for his word. Everyone just hops on the Macchiarini bandwagon, and they're not that critical about what's really going on. And on top of that, he is still doing these surgeries, not just at Karolinska, but he's traveling to do them at institutions all over Europe. So it's the Vanity Fair piece, along with the Swedish documentary exposing Macchiarini, that finally brings him down. Do you think he got what he deserved? Of course not! Karolinska finally launches their own investigation, and they clear him of scientific misconduct charges. In the report, they say that his handling of his patients was a little sloppy, and he is cleared but he's cleared of charges anyway. Second was money and reputation. Macchiarini was bringing in millions in research funding for Karolinska, and they didn't want to get rid of that. Also, they're one of the top medical research institutions in the world, and they didn't want to be plagued by scandal, so they tried to cover it up.
The point I would like to stress is that at any given time, it's important to check what people have told you before forming an opinion. It's okay to admit you don't know when you haven't done even a cursory check of the information that is shared with you. Remaining agnostic until you are able to educate yourself is all that can be reasonably expected of you. You give people an inch and they take a mile. There's no need to rush to snap judgment if you have the luxury of following up on what it is you're trying to know more about. No one knows everything. No one can know everything. It is especially important to be willing to update your understanding of the workings of the world, even if the latest information is polar opposite to what you used to think. It's okay to have been wrong, but it's not okay to be unable to admit when you're wrong. It's not okay to continue to perpetuate lies and harm, especially not about something as fundamental as proper human nutrition. It's even worse when we turn a blind eye to the real harm that is being done, and when we don't do the right thing after the realization of our folly.
Finally, he was repeatedly enabled over the course of years, not just by Karolinska, but by journals who published his work without being critical of it, and by the media as well, who published article after article, documentary after documentary, claiming that this was a breakthrough, this was the next revolution. And it wasn't.